Good morning. This is Jackie Clement, CEO and Executive Director of the Fair Media Council. I'm here to welcome you to today's workshop. It's not them, it's you. Why reporters and editors aren't returning your calls, which will be presented by Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, CEO and President of the Family and Children's Association. Before we get to the main event, I want to point out two upcoming virtual events which are free for members. On May 11, we fast chat with Colin Pereira from the Committee to Protect Journalists on the growing threats journalists are facing, both here and abroad, and how that impacts your right to know as citizens. Then on June 8, we switch gears to talk business and how to future-proof your organization for the post-COVID era. For that, we chat with Now of Work's Rocky Ozaki. Registration is now open. Simply go to fairmediacouncil.org to reserve your spot. Today's workshop is part of a relatively new series FMC has created specifically for members. And we are grateful to St. Joseph's College for sponsoring this series. We focus on improving communication skills in general and media relations skills in particular. Today, we asked Dr. Reynolds to be our presenter because he's a great case study that showcases how communication isn't a project, but rather a philosophy that fosters leadership, and that makes him an effective advocate. In fact, Jeff has become the media's go-to expert on certain health issues, which he can give details on. I've watched him put a lot of time and effort into establishing relationships with the news media and working to understand what the news media wants and needs from him in order to get his message out. And he has used the resources of the Fair Media Council for a long time. So in short, he's paid his dues. As always, your questions are welcome. Please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. It's up to Jeff how the workshop will run. So I'm turning things over to him now, and he can explain if he'd like to take questions as he goes along or at the end. So good morning, Dr. Reynolds.
Hi, Jackie. How are you? So
I'm
formal
good.
this morning. So have you given me control over screens and such?
Let me see. That is a good question. Let me make you the host, and then I will get out of your way.
You know, I have control issues, so.
Hang on a second. My screen is giving me issues with Zoom this morning. All right, I'm going to make you the host.
All right.
And then I'm going to turn off my audio so you are completely in charge.
Awesome. And what I'm going to try to do is see if I can screen share. I don't know.
I'm going to stop my screen share so you can go to yours.
Awesome.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, Jackie. All right. So thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. If you recall, we talked about this maybe sometime in December, and May seemed like so far away. And here we are on Cinco de Mayo. And I get the opportunity to share some insights, some ideas, some tips. Take what you like, leave the rest. I did prepare some slides which suggest a level of formality that I don't fully intend. So if you have questions, I guess we could probably hold them to the end just so that I don't have to look for the raised hands and that kind of thing. So I'll stop at about 10:45 to make sure that we have adequate time for you all ask questions. Feel free to put them in the chat box. If there's something that looks like it's directly on point and I don't want to lose it, then maybe I'll jump to the question. But otherwise, let's try to do them at the end. Some of what I'm going to give you are kind of deep, dark secrets. Some of it is just common sense and a reinforcement of common sense and kind of the basics of PR 101. But I hope you get some value out of this. For folks that aren't necessarily familiar with FCA, we've been around for 136 years. Started as an orphanage here in Nassau County in the late 1800s, and since have grown to an organization that serves more than 30,000 Long Islanders per year. We have an annual budget of about $22 million, 340 staff, and programs in both Nassau and Suffolk County that include everything from a nursery school cooperative for recently arrived immigrants in the village of Hempstead, to substance abuse treatment programs, Nassau County's only shelter for runaway, homeless, and trafficked kids, and a very broad children's mental health program. You know, when I mentioned that we've been around for 136 years, the takeaway from that is, you know, managing through COVID was not this organization's first pandemic. Our founders battled through the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago, and I'm really proud of how our staff navigated through this pandemic. Having said that, we rely heavily on PR and branding and marketing for a variety of reasons, as most not-for-profits do. One of them is to let consumers in the community know that we exist and that we're here to help. Two, to encourage volunteerism and to include people to come and work here, sometimes for not a lot of money, but for a feel-good feeling at the end of the day. And then the last reason, of course, is development and fundraising, and that we need to raise our profile, convey our value proposition so that folks in the community come to understand that we're a really good investment when it comes to charitable dollars. You know, we focus heavily on our PR efforts and do have folks both internally and externally that help us with all of this. When Jackie and I talked about a snappy title, why reporters aren't returning your calls, seemed to be something that would catch attention, and hopefully it did. And you know, the long and short of it is sometimes a phone call is not the best initial approach or ongoing approach in dealing with reporters. There was a meme I saw, I guess going back a couple months ago on Facebook, that said the best time to call me is, and then it was X'd out and it said just text me. And in reality, we all kind of know that sinking feeling we get when our phone lights up versus a quick text. And so, you know, what I would say is, you know, very often reaching out to somebody via phone, particular reporter, is not the best way to make that initial approach, I think. And there are a couple of ways of doing this, but, you know, I think the best way is a short, well-crafted, courteous email. It gives a reporter who's typically hurried, typically on a deadline, typically working remotely, typically juggling multiple priorities, the ability to read that at their leisure. I've also seen pitch emails that run several pages and are 1,000 words. You know, we're in an environment where time is a very, very precious commodity, where that reporter is likely to scan that email really quickly, see if there's any immediate interest. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to stand out and that you're going to get their attention, that you're doing that very quickly and concisely, and that you get to the point. No need to include your entire life story. You know, in the case of FCA, we certainly don't include every step along our 136-year journey. But there's a quick intro. Here's who I am. Here's my organization. Here's the story that we're thinking about. Here's how we can bring the story to life. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then here's the best way to get back in touch. I will say, social media increasingly is a venue for doing that. Although I'll add a caution, and it's something that I'll reinforce throughout the course of our time together this morning. And that is, you know, pick your timing, pick, you know, your approach. You know, if you're hitting up reporters on DMs every day with a different story topic and doing this pitch, you very quickly become an annoyance rather than a trusted source. And so it's real important to be very measured about how you do these things and understand that calls and texts have a particular urgency to them. And if you're calling to pitch an evergreen story at a time when, for example, yesterday they were covering the funeral of a police officer killed, the likelihood that they're going to respond to you or respond to that is not all that great. Also understand, and I think, you know, most people who would be viewing this or part of this conversation understand that the timing is important on all of this. You want to take a look and see what else is going on in the world. And as an organization that operates in Hempstead, we were very focused on the shooting that happened, you know, a week or so ago. And that was not the day or time to begin calling crime reporters about the upswing in opioid overdoses. And so along those lines, understanding the way a reporter's day works is really important. And Jackie's been great, and the Fair Media Council has done a number of panels that I've participated in that include reporters, and I'm not a reporter, but that include reporters about, you know, if I'm rushing a story to air at 4 o'clock, it's not a great idea to send evergreen pitches, you know, at 3:30. If you're someone that works for News 12, News 12 has its morning editorial meeting, that reporter doesn't necessarily know, or an editor doesn't know exactly what they're going to be covering at 8 a.m. If you hit them up at 10 a.m., there's a pretty good chance that they're making those decisions right then and there. And so an evergreen story pitched at 10 a.m. during a morning planning meeting also is likely to fall on deaf ears. So understanding the right time, and that varies by venue, but understanding the right time to make that pitch is as important as anything else. One of the other reasons that you might not get a response, whether you're on the phone, via text, via DM, via email, that you don't get a great response from that person, is that they don't cover that beat. You're contacting the wrong person. And very often reporters will be kind enough to say, I don't write about that. I don't cover that. That's kind of not my thing. But I forwarded this to the person who is. And good reporters that have a little bit of extra time will actually do that because it helps out their colleagues, and it's a good thing to do. But not everybody has that time or level of patience. And I would say generally, if you do that more than once, your pleas are going to fall on deaf ears. And so understand, and the Fair Media Council does a great job of putting out an annual guide for members in terms of who's covering what, but understand this, it changes very, very rapidly. And as the head count at some media outlets begins to dwindle because the advertising revenue isn't necessarily there, reporters are frequently forced to cover or asked to cover larger beats, larger catchment areas, and that kind of thing. And so, you know, at Newsday, there are town editors, there are folks who cover exclusively crime, folks who cover almost exclusively health. Same thing goes for News 12. Which has a health reporter, an education reporter. And so if you've got a story about gardening, contacting Michael O'Keefe because you ran into him at an event, who's Newsday's crime reporter, you're not likely to get a great response. And it's going to become clear that you haven't done your homework before you made the approach. And so understand, you know, a little bit of research goes a long way, and Jackie and the Fair Media Council have emphasized this for as long as, you know, I can remember, and that doing some research up front, watching some of the stories produced by that person or reported out by that person, reading some of the articles that they published, whether it be in Long Island Business News, whether it be in Newsday, you know, understand that there are different beats. And along those lines, while Newsday is more general interest, something like Long Island Business News needs to have a business focus to it. And look, that's a broad type of thing. I work in the not-for-profit sector, and very often we have stories that were included in a Long Island Business News, but we always try to draw that connection. So if we're talking about access to affordable housing, then we talk about that in terms of Long Island's overall economy. If we're talking about opioid addiction or mental health issues, then we talk about how that impacts the workforce or how that impacts public safety for our region. Again, always drawing back that connection and not sending out a generic thing to say, well, I have this great story. It should be tailored pretty specifically, or rather very specifically, to that publication, to that reporter, and, you know, maybe some other recent articles along or stories along those lines. The editorial changes are fast and furious. You know, some of you know that the op-ed editor at Newsday recently left, and there's an intern there, and I'm not even sure if she's still the intern because she did have the title of intern. But understand that those changes happen pretty rapidly, and try to stay on top of those to the best you can. I mean, that comes from just spending some time doing your research, communicating with folks at those particular outlets, having conversations with them. I will say, and I'm going to talk a little bit about building the brand and social media and why some of the other things we do are important in terms of building the reputation. in the case of the change at Newsday, I always dealt with Eli Reyes in terms of pitching op-eds, and some of you probably know that you can't pitch those more than 4 times a year, maybe 5 times a year, and they need to be really on point and on target, timely and well written. And once you develop that reputation, it becomes a little bit easier to pitch things. But honestly, I didn't even know that Eli had left Newsday until I got a LinkedIn message from the interim editor who said, "Hey, I'm the intern op-ed editor. I'm looking for a piece on driver safety and marijuana. I see you've done a lot around marijuana. Do you have thoughts about this, or do you know of someone who could talk a little bit about the technical aspects of marijuana impairment and how it might impact public safety?" And I said, "Well, I may or may not be your guy, but here's what I could offer you." And 6 days later, the op-ed ran in Newsday. And so sometimes making sure that you have that presence on social media means that you're not always chasing stories and you're not always chasing reporters or assignment editors. They sometimes come to you and say, "Hey, I noticed that you seem to have a particular passion for this. You seem to have some knowledge about this. Would you like to do this?" And that part of this is, yeah, you want to be proactive and reach out to reporters and editors, but more importantly, or equally as important, you want to make sure that you're building up your credibility on social media, in other stories, as the go-to person on any number of issues. Jackie mentioned that I participated in a number of stories on Long Island over the course of the past decade related to opioid addiction. Certainly not the only voice on that, nor do I want to be. And we'll talk a little bit about our obligation ethically to amplify other voices. But it's one of those things that the more you can establish your credibility, the more you can give good, solid quotes that stand up to scrutiny. There's a synergy there that builds on itself and makes the job a little bit easier. So misstep number 2, you're contacting the wrong person at the wrong time. Make sure that you're making the approach to the right publication with the right focus to the right person, and doing it in a way that's clear, concise, respectful, and packaged really well. One of the things I've seen, and here at FCA, although I often act as the agency spokesperson, I'm really keyed into the fact that I'm not always the best spokesperson, and there are times when somebody else is better prepared or better positioned to make some of those statements. Sometimes that is a staff member, sometimes it's a volunteer, sometimes it's a board member, but very often that's a client. I can't tell you how many reporters have said to me, "Hey, I got a great news release from X, Y, and Z organization. It sounded great." I called them to try to get their CEO engaged in an interview, and they said that that person wasn't available for another week. One of the things that's really important is that you understand the difference between a media advisory and a press release, that those things are, again, clear, concise, and well written. And if you do a pitch, you need to make sure that the folks who are going to be part of the story are available. Media relations is in no way, shape, or form a 9-to-5 job. And if you hit up a reporter at 4:30 because their stories are done for the day, and they begin kind of planning out the next day, and they call your office at 5:05 and you're long gone, that story will likely die, or they'll move on to somebody else. We need to understand that media, especially in this environment of 24/7 news cycle, really is a 24/7 job. Again, that's in some ways how you build up the relationships. Very often reporters will get thrown onto a story and say, "I know it's a Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, but we're doing X, Y, and Z. Would you be available?" Your willingness and ability to say yes goes a long way towards building that capital. And there are sometimes stories that you'll pitch, and kind of building that bank of goodwill and that bank of availability goes a long way. And I think, the underlying principle here is that it's a two-way street, that this is about creating relationships. There are lots of times when I get calls on Sunday mornings from an assignment editor at News 12 or somewhere else. The last thing I feel like doing is meeting you at my office to talk about an issue that we probably could have talked about on Friday, but that's not up to me to determine. And so the more we can roll with it and help out and work in that cooperative way and create that accessibility. And it's literally an always on accessibility, the better you're going to be positioned for a story that you want, that maybe an editor or reporter feels about, but it's something that you want for your organization or something you feel very, very passionate about. If you promise to produce someone, do so. And so one of the things that we've seen is that, and I've seen this in press releases very often, particularly around some of the rallies and protests that have happened. I've seen media advisories that say, you know, hundreds or thousands will protest in this day and this place, and reporters get there and there's 15 people. You know, that kind of stuff, those kinds of broken promises, you know, they're not good for any relationship. But in terms of building media credibility and building those relationships, that media outlet and that reporter just carved out a block of time because you were going to produce several hundred people. They get there in the rain and there's 4 people holding signs. Probably not going to build a lot of goodwill. And the next time you send something out, they're going to say, aren't these the people that organized the thing that 4 people showed up? Be honest and truthful. If you're only going to have 4 people, say this is what it's going to be. Same thing goes for organizations that line up impacted families. And so I've mentioned the opioid crisis a couple times, and it's really nice to have people with letters after their name comment on what's happening around opioids and overdoses and give fatality numbers and talk a little bit about how opioid dependence works. It's actually equally as powerful, if not more so, to have someone who has struggled with that problem talk about it, or to have a family who might have lost a loved one. That's the human interest side of this. And so as I pitched some of those stories about the recent increase in opioid overdoses directly related to COVID, as I pitched reporters, although I didn't have to pitch very hard because everybody knew that this was going to happen and it played out that way. But as I did the pitch, there were official statistics from the police department and the medical examiner. There was an analysis as to why this all happened. And then there was a promise that the human interest element of this was going to be, and I have a young person in recovery from opioid addiction who could talk a lot about how hard it was to maintain that recovery during COVID. Or I have a family member who lost a loved one who can talk about what it's like and bring those overdoses to life and talk about the human element piece of this. If I had just gone and said, overdoses are up, I think you ought to write about this, or I think you ought to do a story about it, they'd look and say, yeah, I don't know if I could find the rest of the elements. Going to them and saying, I have all of the elements for you is really critical. You can best believe that if I get reporters covering that story and say, yes, so we want to do this, we're going to do it this afternoon. And then I say, all right, so the guy I had who was going to talk to you about his personal experience is out. You only have me. That's not going to fly very well. And so I promised something I couldn't deliver. And so you want to make sure that you have all of those elements lined up. Also, with some backup in place in the event that something happens, somebody's schedule changes, somebody has second thoughts about whether or not to do this. And media is not for everybody. I think we've learned this. There are some people who do it really well. There are other people who don't do it as well. There are people who are scared to death of doing it. And there are other people that love doing it. And you've got to sort out, so who is the best person to do this? Along those lines, that lived experience is something that I think is really important, particularly if we're talking about stories that have that human side. And almost every story does. You know, I work in a space where a lot of the things that we're talking about really embody a need for change or involve disturbing trends on Long Island. And so, you know, the stories over the course of the past week for us have been marijuana legalization and what it means to traffic safety, or what it means to folks with mental health issues. There have been stories about opioid overdoses. There have been stories about the increase in gaming opportunities here in New York State and what that means to 1 to 1.5% of folks who suffer from problem gambling. And so that means finding someone who might have struggled with these problems in the past. One of the things as a not-for-profit organization that gives us a leg up on other not-for-profits is that we're pretty direct in saying that Well, there are a whole bunch of rules and regulations that very often preclude the media from interviewing patients without proper guidelines in place. The fact that many organizations hide behind HIPAA and say, yeah, we don't want to exploit people, those kinds of things, really gives us an opportunity, because as an organization, we believe that folks with lived experience have very, very powerful messages to share. We believe that amplifying their stories is good for them and liberating for them. We also believe that it's really, really educational for the community at large to understand that their own neighbors are suffering from some of the things that they attribute to being a New York City problem or an urban problem or somebody else's issue. And so we spend a lot of time doing media training with consumers about how to speak to the media, what to say, helping them to hone in their narratives in terms of what portions of their story they're comfortable telling versus what portions of the story maybe should be left for another day. And so and we've done a series of stories with women who have struggled with alcohol use, especially during COVID, when alcohol was the only essential service for a long period of time. And we went from not being able to have an open container, walking out of a restaurant, to, hey, back up your car and we'll dump a 55-gallon drum worth of margaritas into your trunk. We saw a dramatic increase in alcohol use among women, and spoke with a lot of women about their willingness to share those stories publicly. And there were some elements of those stories, particularly if they had school-age children, that were not part of the narrative, that were not part of those stories, but other pieces that were. And spending some time with families, prepping them and saying, so let's talk about the implications if you go public with this. What are the implications for your kids, for your neighborhood, your relationships, future employment, those kinds of things. But we make sure that they're prepped up. And when families are ready, willing, and able to tell those stories, that's the goal. That's where the magic happens. And the magic happens not only in terms of reporters saying, yes, this is a phenomenal story, but where the public can connect with these stories in a different way. I've talked about it in terms of the not-for-profit sector, but it applies to everything else as well. So an award-winning series that Newsday produced about groundwater contamination and the responsibility of the folks who caused that contamination and what remediation looks like is really, really important. But interviewing some folks that are within that plume, with their faucet on and getting a drink of water, saying, every time I take a sip, it makes me nervous, and I've contemplated selling my home, but I can't afford to do that right now, is much more powerful than getting into the logistics and mechanics of the aquifer. And so those human touches make the stories much more relatable. I would say for not-for-profits, don't be someone you're not. And so here at FCA, we affirmatively employ people that have lived experience. So we have programs focused on violence prevention that involves folks who have a prior history of gang affiliation and have done, in a lot of cases, significant jail time related to weapons and violence. And they become our credible messengers out in the street rather than me in a suit and tie telling people that violence is wrong. Same thing goes for our addiction and mental health programs, and that we have staff who have that lived experience, who have struggled through addiction and found a path to recovery, folks who have struggled with mental health disorders, or have children who have struggled with mental health disorders. They become really important messengers in the story. And so not only in terms of the story, but in terms of the work they do day in and day out. So we're not twisting this into something that we're not. And again, we want to make sure that we're amplifying those voices and handing to that reporter the human side of the story. I could say to them, look, opioid addiction is up. You ought to go find someone who maybe suffered a loss. It's not going to be that successful. And quite frankly, they don't have the time to do it. So with all of these stories, make sure that the elements are there and in place. This slide says, your story isn't interesting. Part of this is figuring out what you would want to hear. And so the fact that your organization is doing another golf outing is great. Probably not going to be on the front page of Newsday or the lead story in the A block on News 12 tonight. Nobody wants to cover your golf outing. If there is something unique about your golf outing, if it is going to benefit a particular charity that has a direct connection to time and place, really important. So when Tunnel to Towers paid the funeral expenses of an officer killed, as well as paid off their mortgage, right? If there are a fundraiser for that, very direct connection right here, right now. Still not going to be on page 1 of Newsday, but it might get a reporter's interest in moving forward. Your gala, unless you have you know, a celebrity keynote speaker or somebody of that stature, again, not likely. It's excruciatingly important to you that you get coverage. It's fascinating to you, but think about it through the lens of the average person sitting in their living room or sitting at their breakfast table. Are they that interested that your charity had another golf outing? Probably not. Create that human element. Is there somebody playing in that golf outing that suffers from the disease that is that's connected to the charity and which benefits from all of this? Look for those connections, but also understand the limitations, that your golf outing isn't breaking news. Misstep number 5. You know, I've been talking about this a little bit. You don't think it's your job to put the story together. It is your job. And I saw an exchange on Facebook last night that it was just pretty timely. And there's a patch reporter who a lot of folks have probably worked with. Her name is Lisa Finn. She's a great reporter. She's done a lot on the opioid crisis, substance use, that kind of thing. Very often will hit me up and say, the governor just announced X, Y, and Z. Do you have any thoughts? And I shoot her back a bunch of narrative and say, take what you need, leave the rest. Just call me if you have any changes. She posted up last night and said, you know, for you folks that are sending out press releases, could you please include a photo that we can actually run as part of the story, that they need art. And so her main point was, if you deliver this to me in a way that's more packaged, I have very little time to be able to do this. And the easier you make my job, the more likely you are to get what you want. And then another reporter, I don't know where she was from, but she chimed in and said, yeah, and by the way, we're a print publication, so please don't argue with me about whether the resolution is high enough and argue about why your artwork is going to look perfectly in the publication. And so there too, the message is, you know, think about everything that reporter needs. Step into their shoes for a moment and think about, if they're going to write a story on patch, are they going to, you know, a stock photo house to go look for a photo that may or may not tell your story very well, or can you send that along? There was, I did an interview, I guess it was the day before yesterday. It was either yesterday or the day before. They all began to blend together. And it was about FCA moving into a new headquarters. And so we sold the building in Mineola, moved to a brand new headquarters here in Garden City. It's 28,000 square feet. We pitched to Long Island Business News as a business story, and that one of Long Island's oldest and largest not-for-profit is moving to a new headquarters. Not particularly interesting. We moved to a new office. Great. So what's the spin? So we had a couple of them. One of them was that the space was donated to us by someone who had been on the board for 31 years now. Space is worth about $3 million. He's very focused on legacy for his kids and believes very, very intently and intentionally on giving back. Great, still interesting. Guy gave you a building. It's phenomenal. His family has a long history on Long Island. That's awesome. Here was the other component. We were planning the space out during the height of COVID, which meant that some of the things that I wanted to do here in the way of co-working spaces and places where people could gather and case conference and all that other kind of stuff, wiped out, no longer going to do it. But we also knew that a lot of our services moved to telehealth and virtual, which meant that I now needed more conference and consultation rooms that had Zoom capacity, that had screens built into them. I needed to make sure that my staff had cubicles that had plexiglass dividers on them. And I had to completely replan the space to account for folks getting mental health services and addiction treatment services in a completely different way. That became the story. So it wasn't that, hey, FCA moved into a new building, you should write about it because it's really nice here. It was, we were looking for a new space. Somebody stepped up and said, suppose I gave you that space. That's phenomenal, right? And so feel good story. But more to the point, service delivery for many not-for-profits changed dramatically. And we need to be able to pivot, and we needed to be able to pivot to accommodate those needs. That became the story, and there'll hopefully be a very positive story in Long Island Business News coming up soon. We were very intentional about that. And in fact, Jackie, you might recall, I was on a panel that I moderated with Dave Winselberg going back, I guess about 1.5 years ago at an FMC event. And he said, what's going on is, Dave covers a lot of real estate stories, that kind of thing. And I had said, we got this deal in the works. I'm not sure it's going to pan out, and he said, well, call me first when you got something to offer up. And he was not able to write this story, and somebody else did, which is great. But it was that conversation I had with him, and he said, call me first. I think I'd like to do that. And from 1.5 years ago, I remember, look, I had this conversation with Dave, and I told him that I would hit him up first and give him the story. And so, I kind of knew going forward, I'm like, all right, I got someone that's willing to do this. I gave him my word. I need to follow up and do both. And that's how we fleshed the story out. Again, who you can add to the story is really important. And one of the other things about this story was that for our staff, who again make almost no money, coming to a place that was more professional, more convenient, brighter, just more uplifting as they help people rebuild their lives. There's also part of the story. So I said, hey, if you'd like to talk to one of our rank and file staff members about what it's like to come work in a really nice place, that would be helpful, because every time we reaffirm that folks that work in the not-for-profit sector should be working around folding card tables and broken chairs, we diminish the importance of the work. And we've also created a new senior center here where seniors can come in and get their taxes done and get case management and things like that. And if you want to talk to one of those seniors about how empowering it feels like to come to a really nice space instead of this hidden away spot on Old Country Road, you could talk to them too. And so build out the entire story and go from, hey, we moved into a nice space and it's really nice, to here are the different elements of the story. Really becomes an easier sell. And that's the kind of thinking that you need to do up front as you think about what your goals are. Misstep number 6, and I'm going to accelerate the pace a little bit because some of the things you'll see in the slides we've actually talked about a little bit. Understand reporters are people too. This is a two-way street. They're prone to human emotions like the rest of us. If you treat them lousy, they're not likely to respond to you. They generally won't treat you lousy back, but you'll simply become irrelevant and they'll move on to someone that's actually a little bit more cooperative in terms of the relationship. That doesn't mean that occasionally you don't have challenging or difficult conversations. That's all part of life, but a little respect certainly goes a long way. Understand that not everything you do is breaking news. Again, if I had called the News 12 assignment desk and said, I've got a news flash, FCA moved into a new space this morning, I'm not sure they're going live at 11:30 to cover that. Another lesson, really important, and this is how you create long-term trusting relationships. There's a reporter from News 12 who called me going back about 3 weeks ago as they were passing the New York State budget. And she said, look, I don't know if you guys do a lot around gambling, but I see that they've expanded sports betting. Is that a sweet spot for you guys and something that you do? And I said to her, there's actually an organization, the New York Council on Problem Gambling, that actually has a local office in RXR Plaza. And they would probably be your go-to, but let me tell you what I know about this, and let me tell you some of my thoughts about this. I still think they're the go-to, but I'll give you some background. And if you can't get them, I'm happy to be your backup, but I think you should actually call them. And so I went into a little bit about problem gambling and what we know about it, and quite frankly, how New York State has not increased services for people who struggle with compulsive gambling. They've actually reduced them as we've added 3 casinos upstate. We added Jake's 58. There's another casino contemplated for Medford, and the Shinnecocks are planning to open a casino. All this and a sports book too. And so I went through some of the ins and outs and said, so call them and I'm happy to be your backup. I didn't say to her, yes, this is our sweet spot. We're able to do this. I'm able to talk to you. I said, I think somebody else is better, but let me give you the background I know. And if you wind up in a jam, call me back. And it turns out she called me back and said, They won't even return my calls. Let's talk. And so we arranged to do this. That goes a long way, right? So we didn't hog the story. We didn't say, yeah, we'll take everything that comes our way. It was, I don't think we're best positioned, but let me tell you what I know and what we think about this. And if you get jammed up, then call me back and I'll give you something on this. And so there, it's that level of goodwill, and it's not, yeah, we don't do this, I can't necessarily help you, but come back to me if I can be helpful. The other thing is if you're going to complain about a story, please do not, be careful how you complain. One of the things that I'm just reading a chat from Jackie. So if I've seen distracted or nuts, this is why. What do you do when a reporter calls you a story and you don't believe in the premise of the story? Okay, so I'm going to get to that. Jackie asked a really good question. There are many times, and I can't tell you how many times I have seen some of my peers hit up a reporter and say, I can't believe you wrote about or you reported on X, Y, and Z and you didn't call us. There is no surer way to guarantee that that person will never call you than if you do that. And if somebody does something wrong, I will tell you generally, yes, misquotes happen. I've been in this for more than 25 years, which shows my age. It's happened to me maybe once. And then I would say a couple of years ago, Newsday inadvertently attributed a quote to me that I didn't say. And I reached out to the reporter and it had been published online and said, I didn't say any of that. And that reporter responded and said, oh my God, you actually didn't. It's somebody else's quote. I will have it fixed. And within minutes, it was fixed. And so this notion that you're going to be woefully misquoted, that it's going to happen all the time, that reporters never get it right, it's just not true. And so if you do have a complaint, there's nothing wrong with having the conversation, but do it constructively and understand, again, there are people too. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. There are times when reporters will call you and say, so X, Y, and Z, have you seen this? Have you seen this? No, I haven't seen this. Send me the release. Let me take a look at it and I'll give you a reaction. And there's other times when they'll call me and I'll say, I don't know the answer to this, but let me turn you on to a couple people who might be able to answer the question, or let me find somebody internally that has a better answer to this. And if I can't find anybody, then at least I can try to send you in the right direction. So it's not, this isn't my deal. I don't know anything about it. I wish you luck. This isn't something we do or something that I can offer you much on, but let me get you to a person who can. Jackie's question is, what do you do when a reporter calls you to be part of a story and you don't believe in the premise of the story? I think, and that doesn't happen to me that often. Sometimes it does. But there are times when I'll say, I look at this in a different way, and here's my take on this. And there might be another angle to this that you're not seeing that I can point out for you. And that's kind of the way I focus on this. It sounds like that's not necessarily the focus of your story. And so somebody else might be better positioned to fit into the puzzle here. And I just don't think that I'm necessarily the one to do it. But quite frankly, I'm a big believer in that very often, our role and responsibility is to educate reporters. We believe that they're experts in absolutely everything. They're not. One day they're covering one topic, the next day they're covering another issue. And then they've got, 40 minutes to come up to speed on yet another brand new issue. Part of what we do is to help shape the message and to educate reporters and say, you said X, Y, and Z, and I think that's a little bit off, and I see it a little bit differently, and here are the reasons why I just see it as being a little bit different. I said we were going to leave some time for questions, so I want to kind of blast through some of this stuff, which we've already covered. Part of establishing yourself as a credible source of information or commentary is just getting out there and doing stuff. I see a number of folks who automatically put thought leader in their Twitter profile and assume that everyone will now believe that they're a thought leader in X, Y, and Z. You've got to demonstrate that. You've got to maintain your social media profiles. Yes, all of them, including LinkedIn, including Twitter. I did an interview with Fox 5, I want to say about a month ago, from a reporter who hit me up on Twitter. I had never met her before. It turns out she's like, we could do a lot of stories together. The first story, I don't remember what it was, but she hit me up and I'm like, I'm just not your guy. I don't think this is a thing for me. And I don't remember what it was. But she said, well, it's nice to meet you anyway. I'm sure we'll do other stories together. And 2 days later, she wrote me back and said, I've been assigned a marijuana story. Could we do this? And so sometimes those keeping up their social media profiles and posting on a regular basis makes a huge difference in whether or not you get the call or your competitor gets the call. Make sure your organization is, the website is up to date, that it's current, that your bio is updated. You know, if it talks about what you did 4 years ago, that's not going to be all that helpful. By now, you've been told 1,000 times at FMC events that you ought to have a news section where all of your releases are categorized. You ought to be putting out statements if you're an organization on certain things. You know, we did statements around the Chauvin verdict. We did, given our social justice focus, we did a statement last week on the FDA coming out and saying that they were going to ban menthol cigarettes and cigars and things like that. Send that around to folks. Say, look, if you're writing about this, you know, we just issued a statement that has a local spin to it that you might be interested. And more often than not, you're going to wind up being dropped into those stories. It literally takes 5 minutes to write up a quick statement. Put it on your website, put it on social media, email it to a couple key reporters. Don't batch and blast it to the entire world, but email it to a couple key reporters. For those of you who are not-for-profit leaders or have an identity that maybe goes beyond that particular organization, having a personal website goes a long way. Having you pop up in search results and having your own social media that gels with your organizational feed is really important. The only proviso I'd give to all of that is you want to ensure that the stuff you're posting personally jives with your organization philosophy, or that you have a very clear disclaimer that says that your views are entirely your own. Even there, you know, what I do personally, I ensure that it steers clear of partisan politics and things like that. I have some pretty strong views when it comes to politics. I recognize that I'm not going to change anybody's mind on social media by posting about those views, but I do understand that I might compromise my organization's independence if I begin putting some of that stuff out there. So be very careful in terms of what you post personally versus professionally. You should be writing opinion pieces and columns as much as you can. Every website out there is begging for content, particularly free content. Every weekly is looking for well-written content. You know, in the past 2 weeks, I've done pieces for the Herald, again on marijuana. I did pieces for Innovate Long Island on marijuana. I did an op-ed for the Long Island Business News. And again, you know, I devoted 2 weeks to writing about the legalization of marijuana and the different aspects of it in terms of highway safety, how we talk to our kids about it when they smell it out in public, the implications around social justice and what it might mean for policing and law enforcement and the disproportionate incarceration of people of color. Again, you can pick that sweet spot and then spin off 4 or 5 pieces of content directly related to that without having to start from scratch all the time. Each and every time. The other piece is you can't be all things to all people. Understand what you're really good at, understand what you could speak on, and leave the rest for somebody else. I have included misstep number 8. Make sure you're prepared when you do interviews. Don't make strong statements without some backup to it. You know, I'd say, you know, understand how to do media. Know what being camera ready looks like. If you put yourself out there and say, I'd love to talk to you about X, Y, and Z, be prepared that a reporter might say, okay, great, can we meet on Zoom in 10 minutes? If you haven't even gotten in the shower yet, that can certainly be tricky, so make sure that you're ready. Also, FMC does a great job at just doing basic media training in terms of how you talk to the media, how to create sound bites that are going to stick. One of my points of pride is trying to be kind of the closer in some of the articles around issues and making sure that you really cut to the chase and say something powerful so that you're either at the top of the story or you're closing out the story for that reporter with a really profound and important statement about what that story means to the local community. Misstep number 9, don't make rookie mistakes. You can't see the article before a reporter prints it. I'm amazed at how many times I hear folks say, you know, I agreed to be interviewed. I hope I can see the article before they run it. It doesn't work that way. And if you ask that, you look like a rookie and you're going to burn some bridges or at least harm your credibility. If an interview doesn't run, understand that things happen. 90%, probably 95% of the time, your interview is going to run. If not on that day, then at a subsequent point in time. But don't hound that reporter saying, I spoke to you for a story. I don't understand why I'm not seeing it in the paper. Or, You know, I watched at 6 o'clock, and by 6:10, you're texting that reporter saying, I don't see myself on TV. Again, rookie mistake. And I'm sure some people are rolling their eyes on this Zoom saying, who would do that? It happens all the time. Don't ask a reporter if you can record the conversation. It's just creepy, and again, doesn't build a lot of goodwill. Don't tout to that media source that you spent $150 advertising on their website, and that's why they should feature you in a story. There's a firewall that's well established and really important between ad sales staff and editorial staff. There's a further firewall between op-ed departments and you know, daily writers and news reporters and that kind of thing, as there absolutely should be. And, you know, almost another terrible thing, I was gonna say the worst thing you could do, but another lousy thing is to say, all right, so if you want to write about this, I'll go to X, Y, and Z. That reporter will invite you to do so, and they'll invite you to do so probably for the foreseeable future, to go seek out their other media source and give them the story. The last one, before I open it up for questions, you don't follow up. You know, I will tell you, we did a presser yesterday. We had to do it yesterday. I ordinarily would not have done it yesterday, but we had to do a presser yesterday because it was a statewide day of action around opioid settlement dollars and how they would be spent here in New York State. And New York State is going to get about $2 billion from the opioid distributors and manufacturers. So we did this presser yesterday, understanding that most reporters were at the funeral for the fallen police officer. But there was a reporter who came and covered it. And she sent me the link to the online story last night. And I made sure to say, thanks for sending the link. And more importantly, thanks so much for covering the story and giving some of those families who have lost children to overdose the ability to talk about how these funds should be spent. A thank you goes a long way. Just hitting up a reporter saying, you know, you did a great job in the story. It was awesome. You don't have to kiss up, but a quick text, a quick email saying, good job. You know, like anything else in life, reporters tend to get communications when somebody's unhappy with something, saying, this was great. Or if you featured a consumer, or in the case of business, you know, you got to feature a business or a story or a new product line, simply sending a quick note to say, hey, thank you. You did a great job. You really captured the essence of what we wanted to convey, goes a long way. Also, and nobody will explicitly ask you to do this, but reposting their stories on social media goes a long way. You know, we live in an environment that's really focused on eyeballs and that kind of thing. And so I'm very conscious of when somebody's good enough to feature FCA in a story, to make sure that I'm posting that on Twitter, that I'm posting that on Facebook, that I'm saying, you know, so-and-so reporter came out today and did a great job covering our story or talking about our program that does X, Y, and Z. You know, again, nobody has ever asked me explicitly to do that, but I do think it goes a long way. And if your goal is to tell a story and their goal is to tell a story, those goals are unified, and we should all do a better job of telling that story to a wider audience. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, stay in touch with them, but don't be a pest. It's kind of like, you know kind of when to hit them up, know when not to hit them up. You know, stay in touch, but understand that they've got 1 million people that are vying for their attention. They've got a story or two per day that they actually need to be doing on a regular basis. And you want to make sure that you're keeping the connection, but not being a pain or appearing desperate. So with that, I'm going to jump into the questions. I didn't leave a ton of time, but I left some. So there's one in the chat that says, what convinced you to make media relations a priority in your work? I think, you know, for the not-for-profit sector, we don't have a ton of money for marketing. I mean, that implies that the for-profit sector does. And I know generally, especially for small businesses, those budgets have been constrained. We recognize that earned media was the way to tell the story, that we couldn't tell it in other ways. And quite frankly, there were things happening in the external environment that we were addressing. It should have been part of the story. If you think about the key issues facing Long Island right now, they're issues where we provide programs and have for some time. And so, you know, some of those issues include, especially related to COVID, the treatment of seniors in nursing homes. And so we said a lot about that and how we thought that was handled, but also talked a little bit about some of the in-home services we were providing to seniors, some of the grief counseling we're doing with them now as they watch their spouses die via FaceTime as they were trapped in nursing homes. Community violence has been a big issue. And as I mentioned, we have folks like me, who believe that gun violence is a crisis and it's a public health issue and it needs to be addressed as such. But more importantly, I have folks that were involved in gun violence in the past who can talk a little bit about why they turned to gun violence. And so it's a way of us telling the story and linking into the issues facing Long Island. Certainly, the issues around opioid addiction have been front and center, and we run 2 addiction treatment centers and 2 recovery centers. It's our sweet spot. If you get into you know, COVID and the number of runaway and homeless kids that could no longer couch surf, there was an angle for us there too. And so we realized that earned media is worth its weight in gold. It's trusted far more than advertising. It offers some public good and public value. And we had a story to tell, and that's why we invested in it. Another question about social media. You know, I do a fair amount myself, not so much for FCA, but on my own personal accounts that obviously tags into FCA. We do have one person who has multiple responsibilities, but one of the other things she does is our social media for us. And so we've got calendared posts that happen every day. And then there are also things like things that happen just spontaneously that we'll post about. Yesterday, when we did the presser on the opioid settlement dollars, you know, not only did we try to get earned media, but we Facebook Lived it, we tweeted about it. We made sure that in addition to those evergreen posts about, hey, if you're struggling with X, Y, and Z, FCA could help you, or we've got jobs available, you know, throughout the day and throughout the week, we'll plug in those more breaking kind of posts. And I communicate directly with her and say, we want to post about X, Y, and Z. And she'll come back to me and say, hey, I was going to post this. Is it okay? We do keep very close tabs on what we post and how we post, just in order to protect the brand. We've also begun to build out social media pages that are focused on our individual programs. And so we found a lot of robust content around runaway, homeless, and trafficked kids here on Long Island. And so we run a program at a house called Nassau Haven, which is a shelter for those young people. And that program has its own built out page in which they do virtual walkthroughs of what it's like to show up at Nassau Haven and get assistance to lower the trepidation that a young person might have to come and knock on the door or to seek our assistance. It features conversations with young people who were formerly homeless about, you know, the importance of connecting with an organization and not trying to do this on your own. And so we've begun to build out those programmatic identities. We do that around Thrive, our recovery centers in Hauppauge and Westbury, with very specific comments and content. So it is 11 o'clock. We ran, Jackie said that this time would go very quickly. It went super fast. I hope that I've given you all something that is of value. I appreciate the questions. More than anything, thank you to Jackie for having me. I know that there'll be a time when FMC real-time events begin to happen again. In the meantime, there's a ton of really good virtual offerings, and I can't wait to see everybody back in person at real-time events, hopefully later this year. Thank you.